You wake to 3 loud knocks at your front door. The clock reads just past 3 a.m. You rush out of bed feeling apprehensive. As you slowly approach the door, a pit forms in your chest when you hear a child's voice.
May we come in?
What do you do when you can't trust your own eyes? When a helpless child arrives at your doorstep or a dark stranger asks a simple question, will you invite me in? For tonight's episode, we'll be diving into an old rule of folklore, mystery, and the paranormal. The rule of invitation, which governs those evil entities that cannot hurt you as long as you don't let them in. I've always been fascinated by the idea of these so-called rules throughout the paranormal world. Things like they can't hurt you if you don't look at them, or you're safe if you don't invite them in. So in our search for logic in the illogical, we'll begin at home. Throughout history, the home has always been a symbol of safety, security, family. We're able to pick and choose who we let into our homes or who we keep out. When a stranger shows up, even at a normal hour, we eye them with suspicion and apprehension. Shelter is among the most primal of instincts, and we've been trying to keep dangers out since the very first home. Locks and doors do well to keep flesh and blood out. But what about evil? For thousands of years, we humans have been fighting to keep evil spirits out of our homes. As doorways and windows are the entryway for the evils of man, they have also long been believed to be vulnerable to the entry of evil itself. So to protect ourselves, humans begin to use magic. Apotropaic magic is a type of magic intended to turn away harm or evil influences, as in deflecting misfortune or averting the evil eye. This type of magic has been used for centuries to protect our homes. Going back to ancient Greece, symbols can be found carved, burned, or painted onto homes. Those of you living in older houses in the UK and Europe may be familiar with these practices. In many of the older houses, you can find objects buried in the walls like specially prepared witch bottles, horse skulls, and the bodies of dried cats, as well as shoes. Also, marks like these, which at first seem random, may be overlooked if you didn't know what you're looking for, but they are in fact put there with purpose. But even without these protections, it is believed that the threshold, on a mythological and spiritual level, is considered as a kind of magical or protective barrier to certain kinds of evil. Some call this the law of dominion, which is a sort of force field surrounding our home and barring them from entry. But there is one weakness: invitation. Now, of the many entities that must follow this rule, the most well-known is, of course, the vampire. And when it comes to vampires, it is only the first invitation that matters. From then on, they may come and go as they please. So even if no harm comes to you on the first visit, from that point on, your threshold no longer holds any power to bar their entry. The idea of the vampire being unable to enter without invitation first showed up in writings in the 17th century when Leo Alladius, who was a Greek theologian and revolutionary of the Italian Renaissance, wrote in one of his manuscripts that the Verkolakis, which is a sort of proto-vampire from Greek legends, cannot harm the occupants of a house unless they answer the door. Here's what the manuscript says. For very often, inhabiting this body, he, the Verkolakis, comes forth from the grave and going abroad through villages and other places where men dwell, more especially at night, he makes his way to whatsoever house he will, and knocking upon the door, he calls aloud a name in a hoarse voice to the one who dwells within. If such a one answers, he is lost, for assuredly he will die the next day. But if he does not answer, he is safe. I believe it's safe to say that the origin of this belief is probably much older. I think it's important to remember that in the old days of Europe, honor played a huge role in society. If a traveler was caught out in a bad storm, he could ask for shelter and food from nearly anyone, and it would be granted with the understanding that he wouldn't rob, kill, or do anything dishonorable while staying as a guest. So as long as he abides by these rules, he can expect warm and dry accommodations, even if it's just in the barn's hayloft, and he would be given food, even if it was just gruel, soup, or oatmeal. He was also expected to help with chores or any other needs that arose. But if he broke this tradition, stole from them, or assaulted the daughter or wife, killed anybody, then the whole of the township would lock up their doors at night and keep an eye out. The law would look for the culprit, and even the homeless or other travelers would try to find them, because it would cause more problems for them. In this way, you can see how vampires played off this tradition of trust, as some creatures, like the vampire, aren't always so obvious to spot at first. Another example of this rule of invitation takes place in the classic German legend Faust. The titular Faust has to invite Mephistopheles into his study 3 times to symbolize his willingness to become involved in the evil the spirit represents. And as someone who grew up in a Christian household, I believe there's a pretty heavy emphasis on the idea that Satan cannot harm us unless we invite him into our lives. And this, of course, doesn't mean literally inviting Satan. This is more of an idea that we, through our choices, are inadvertently inviting evil into our lives. Each time we make a small, dishonest, or hurtful decision, the next one becomes easier, and so on until this so-called evil has consumed every part of our life. And my mother used to chastise me for watching violent or scary movies, as she said that I was inviting evil into my mind with every movie that I watched. If you're enjoying the video so far, don't forget to like and subscribe if you haven't. Alright, so as these traditions and protections have been left behind in the modern age, some of the evil at our door has not. According to witnesses and encounter stories throughout the last century, these things don't just stand around asking to get in, especially when just one look at them turns your stomach to knots and sends your heart to your feet. And they've learned that we don't trust them on instinct, so it seems the best way to prey on us is to use our own instincts against us. So as our story comes into the modern age, so have these beings with the Black-Eyed Kids. The first reported encounter of black-eyed kids happened in 1996, when Texas reporter Brian Bethel had a terrifying encounter with 2 of these black-eyed kids in Abilene, Texas. Brian was sitting in his car one night outside of a movie theater when he was startled by a knock at his window. Outside, 2 children wearing hoodies were staring at him blankly. Bethel described feeling an unexplainable jolt of fear run straight through his whole body, and while they looked like ordinary kids, a heavy sense of dread fell over him. He rolled down the car window, but just enough to talk with the kids and figure out what they wanted. The kids told Bethel that they were there to see the new Mortal Kombat movie, but had forgotten their money and needed a ride back home to grab it. There was definitely something wrong with the boys, but Bethel was unsure exactly what it was. Maybe the way they didn't speak like children. Maybe it was the way they had appeared from out of nowhere. Regardless, every word coming from the boys' mouth seemed to send a shiver down Bethel's spine. When he tried to make out the boys' faces, Bethel then noticed their pitch-black eyes. The boys said, "Oh, come on, mister. We won't hurt you. You have to let us in. We don't have a gun." Bethel threw the car in reverse and fled. When he looked in the rearview mirror, the boys had vanished. After posting his story on the internet, he was surprised by the amount of support he received and stories from others who had encounters very similar to his own. So, these creatures not only require permission to enter a house, but also his car. So what are the limits to this rule? For example, what about a tent? Anyone who's been camping understands that feeling of security and safety a tent provides, even if it goes against logic. I mean, how can a thin sliver of nylon truly protect us from the beasts we fear in the shadows beyond the light of the campfire? If we assume that this barrier is in fact a real force, then it makes sense why these evil creatures would have a strategy of fooling us to try and help or scaring us into flight. We've all heard stories about voices trying to lure someone outside of their tent or into the woods. Voices that sound like friends or loved ones. Maybe it's the belief itself, no matter how irrational, that gives the barrier its power, whether home, tent, car, or anything of that nature. So what happens if you do let the black-eyed kids inside? Well, according to one encounter, you may not know the real consequences of your actions until well after the event. In January of 2016, a woman in Vermont made the tragic mistake of letting two black-eyed children into her home. A blizzard was raging outside when she heard a faint knocking on her front door. A boy and girl stood there, shivering, begging to use her phone. Unnerved by their presence, the woman nevertheless let them in and went to retrieve the phone. After the children walked into the light of the family room, the woman realized their eyes were completely black. As she stared at them in horror, her husband's nose began to bleed at the same time that the power suddenly went out. After what felt like an eternity, the children spoke in unison, saying that their parents had arrived. The wife then noticed that there were two men at the end of the driveway. The men were very tall and slender. The wife waved but did not receive the same friendly gesture. The woman watched as the kids quietly left her house and entered the nondescript black car. Not long after the strange encounter, the woman's husband was diagnosed with severe skin cancer. The woman then began to suffer from regular nosebleeds and an onslaught of other medical issues. She's convinced that her failing health, along with her husband's, is the result of the black-eyed children she unwittingly let into their home. Now, I picked the black-eyed kids stories because they are the most recent and comprehensive tales that we have of this rule in action. But as I said earlier in the episode, you can see this behavior across a huge spectrum of cryptids and paranormal myths and legends. So what do you believe? Could we be using magic ourselves without even knowing it? Or is this all just based on myth, fiction, and horror novels, movies, and creepypastas? So I want to leave you with a few final questions, and feel free to give your opinions down in the comments. If these rules do exist, how and when did they come to be, and who enforces them? Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please leave a like and subscribe if you haven't. I also have a donation link down in the description if you're so inclined. Now, if you need something to watch, why not watch this video on the Paranormal Iceberg Explained? Thanks everybody. Good night.
May we come in?